Quick show of hands. How many of you are familiar with Singularity University? Okay, and a bunch of you probably have never heard of it. Is that true? Okay. So what we do is we bring together the leading thinkers in the world in the fastest moving technologies. So anything from synthetic biology to robotics to neuroscience to medicine to energy. And we think about how quickly these technologies are accelerating. You've seen and you heard yesterday how disruptive the world is becoming. We're seeing new business models all layering on this information model that's exploding onto the world. Google 10 years ago was pretty much nothing, and now it's one of the biggest companies in the world, essentially by manipulating text and now video, right? Facebook, $100 billion company, just by digitizing our relationships. Groupon, Foursquare, others are attacking the Yellow Pages industry, right? Thank God somebody's doing that. And we have today about 8 billion connected devices on the internet. 10 years ago, that was about 400 million. We've gone to 8 billion. In 10 years, we'll be at 50 billion. And in about 10 years after that, we'll be at 1 trillion. So if you just look at that metric, we're at 8 billion today. We're going to go to 1 trillion in a couple of decades. We think we're 30, 40 years into this information revolution. On that metric, we're just about 1%. We're just starting, right? And so this is the model that we're seeing all new information businesses, all new businesses are laying on top of this model, and I think you're pretty clear about that. And this shift from this linear material perspective to this digital perspective has a very visceral difference in how we the cognitive abilities and our ability to process it. Some of you are old enough to remember film photography. When you operate in film photography, you're operating from a material basis. The cost of the film, the cost of the processing, about $1 a photograph. When you shift to digital photography, the marginal cost of an extra photograph goes to zero, right? You can take 1 billion more photographs, and now storage is essentially free. Now you're operating from an abundance model. You use a completely different sets of techniques, filtering, social technologies, and so on to manage it. And so we go from this material shift to this digital shift. We see this explosion in the environment, and the entire substrate changes from this physical to this digital world. We're now seeing that happen across all of these technologies, whether it's robotics, whether it's sensors, whether it's medicine, healthcare, even energy. Energy is operating on that basis and moving into this digital world. When you have something in an information-based environment, you can do all these interesting things with it. You can do machine learning and AI and modeling and simulation. You can move and copy it around, et cetera, et cetera. And so this shift is what we're seeing across the board. Is my microphone?
There you go.
Okay. Okay. Is that better? Okay. We have a joke at Singularity that AI is really easy, but AV is really hard. Always, it's the complexity of navigating all of that is always tricky. So this is Vinod Khosla, many of you are familiar with. He came and spoke at our closing ceremonies a couple of years ago, and he highlighted a really interesting trend. He looked at the growth of mobile phones over the last 10 years. We've seen exponential growth in mobile phones, doubling every couple of years from 100 million to, 5.5 billion now. And what he noticed was that he went back to 2002, 2004, 2006, 2008, and he asked the question, how well did the mobile industry expert analysts predict that growth of mobile phones? And he found that all of the analysts predicted in 2002 collectively about 16% year-on-year growth. 2 years later, it had gone up 100%. In 2004, they predicted 14% would be the pace of growth. Doubled again. 2006, they predicted 12%, doubled again. In 2008, they predicted 10%, and it doubled again, right? Now, that's not a math error. Something much more fundamental is going on to make such a radical gap in what you think is going to happen and what actually happens. Many of you are familiar with the famous McKinsey's prediction in 1984 that the worldwide market for mobile phones would not exceed 1 million units. Right? And they advised AT&T to get out of the phone business, and AT&T left the cellular business as a result. Right? And the reason was if you had those big briefcase phones, you wouldn't sell more than 1 million of those. They missed the fact that the phones were shrinking and halving in size every year or so. And in a few years, we had a clamshell. And so this is this gap that we're seeing, and we are not good at spotting this gap. Human beings cognitively look linearly at pretty much everything. If I take 30 steps linearly, I'll get out to the lobby, and you can all gauge very well where am I 1/3 of the way or where am I 2/3 of the way in that progression. If I take 30 doubling steps, exponential steps, 2, 4, 8, 16, at step 30, I'm at 1 billion. I'm 26 times around the world, and it's very hard to gauge where am I 1/3 of the way and where am I 2/3 of the way in that prediction. And this is the gap that we're seeing around the world, both in business but also in society. The Arab Spring is a manifestation of that. The younger generation is leveraging information in a way that the older generation can't even conceive of, and that's causing this big gap. And we study that gap between linear structures in the world and this exponentially growing powered world, powered by the digital world. And what happens is when you have an exponential curve, you discount it early on. You kind of go, nothing's going on. We've seen this with nanotechnology. You saw this with 3D printing. The Gartner hype cycle is another way of manifesting and demonstrating it. Then we hit the knee of the curve, all hell breaks loose, and everybody goes, black swan. Right? But if you could spot the underlying trend early enough, you would see that curve. And we're trying to track those curves in all of the technologies that we spot. You heard from John Hagel yesterday. His colleague John Seeley Brown, who ran Xerox PARC for a couple of years, made this fantastic comment a few weeks ago to the commencement address. And he noticed that all of our business structures are built upon scalable efficiency, right? In a linear model. All strategic planning operates on a linear basis pretty much. Yet the world is moving on an exponential basis, and our old structures simply can't manage. And we're seeing a different type of organization structure pop up, and I'm going to touch on what that looks like. So at Yahoo, I spent a couple of years running their incubator in 2006 to 2008, pretty much while Jerry Yang was CEO. And they asked me to go build a separate unit, Skunkworks, off to the side. And it was very successful. We looked at about 3,000 ideas around the company, and my role was great. It was kind of like pick the best 5 and be building the best 5 projects. If something needs to scale, fold it back into the mothership. Now the problem is, how many of you are familiar with or have this corporate incubation model or have experimented with in the past? Can I just see a show of hands? Quite a few of you, right? The problem is the model doesn't work. And the reason that the model doesn't work is that the immune system of the company will come and attack it. Right? So it's an organic beast. All businesses are set up to resist change. And therefore, when something like this happens, it disrupts it. If you build something really interesting, it's going to cut across a couple of the different business units, and then you get into political fights as to where should it fit. And if you try and wedge it into one place, it doesn't map onto the product very well, and you lose the external focus. Right? So if you do this external innovation, you simply can't bring it back into the company. Even when we're having the same problem when we do acquisitions. Where does it fit? How neatly does it fit in the company? The integration of those is extremely difficult. I think it's important to do these type of projects, but it has to be stealth, report directly to the CIO and CEOs, as your eyes and ears as to what's happening in technology. At Yahoo, we made the mistake of using it as a PR vehicle, and that just paints a big bullseye on top of you, right? And so I'm now advising some large companies about how to deal with this because it's very hard to navigate this model. So we're seeing a totally new type of organization structure pop up as a result, and I'm actually writing a book on this and researching this phenomena right now. We call these exponential organizations. We've learned how to scale technology now pretty well. Right? Despite the blips and so on, we can go pretty seamlessly from 1 user to 1 million users to 10 million users using cloud services, etc. Building the organization is painfully linear and painfully incremental. And the way we've done it in the past is basically brought together assets or a workforce into one legal organizational unit, and then we try and sell access to it. That's essentially how we've built all of our organizations around the world. We're seeing a new breed now that instead of bringing everything internally is tapping into the resources externally and leveraging that and acting, John Hagel calls it stocks versus flows. And we're moving from trying to create a stock of something to being basically embedded in the flow of what's going on. And we're seeing examples of this. TED would be an example, right? Normal standard conference, nice high end. Chris Anderson takes it over, releases all the TED Talks for free, lets the community unleashed on the TEDx events, and all of a sudden you have a global media phenomena in 2 or 3 years. Unprecedented, right? And this is an interesting example. If he'd gone down the classic linear model and stood up one day and said to his team, we're going to do these TEDx event things, and we're going to have 8,000 of them within 5 years, he would have lost the entire team. People have said, there's no way you can handle that. What he did was he just let it go, let the community drive it, created a narrow set of rails on how you run one of these TEDx events, and they're actually on track to do 8,000 events within 5 years. But the linear planning route would have said, let's do 20 in Q1, let's do 40 in Q2, 60 in Q3, 80 in Q4, then it'll level out a bit, so then maybe we can only do 10 new events a month over the next couple of years. And in aggregate, you'd end up with about 1,000 or 2,000 events over that 5 years, and you would have left a lot on the table. Right? So there's this interesting problem that we now have, that you can't do classic planning in this disruptive world. Because if you accurately predict where things are going to go, everybody gets freaked out and you lose them. If you go down the linear model, you leave a lot on the table. So how do you navigate this? We're seeing now this new breed of organization. How many of you are familiar with Quirky? Can you see a show of hands? So Quirky is a consumer packaged goods company. Procter & Gamble, or a normal CPG company, takes about 250 to 300 days to get a new idea from invention of idea to having it being sold in Walmart or Bed Bath & Beyond. Okay? Quirky does that same process in 29 days. 29 days from invention of an idea to it being sold in Walmart, right? Unbelievable. Kaggle, how many of you are familiar with Kaggle? Right, so some of you. They've created a social network of 100,000 data scientists around the world. They've run 350 contests where they've kind of exposed an algorithm to the outside community, anonymized the data to protect the enterprise information. And they've achieved some outstanding results. So Allstate exposed their claims algorithm. They've been working at Allstate has 40 or 50 of the best actuaries and data scientists in the world. They've been working on this claims data algorithm for 60, 70 years. They opened it up to a contest and said, could the external community of data scientists do better? Within 3 days, the external community had beaten Allstate's best internal actuaries, and by the end of it, the algorithm was 340% better than what Allstate could do itself. Right? Represented about a net saving is about $50 million a year, and it cost them $10,000 to run the contest. And so Kaggle is running contests for clients on taking data, anonymizing it, exposing it to their social network, and seeing how they can improve on it. And so that's a fascinating model to look at. We don't have any interest in any of these companies, by the way. I just find them very interesting. Local Motors creates a new car based on crowdsourced design. A Ford, or a big company, takes about $3 billion to get a car from concept to production. They create a totally new car in about $3 million. Right? They basically crowdsource every element of the car, and they can create a brand new model, totally crowdsourced. Gigwalk, how many of you are familiar with Gigwalk? Right, so Gigwalk is a crowdsourcing, a crowd working platform, 225,000 people. If you're in Procter & Gamble, you can basically say, go into every Walmart around you and tell me whether our products are on the right shelves and have the right merchandising or sales promotion on it. And within an hour, several tens of thousands of people can go into Walmarts all around the country and do this, right? And so we're seeing these companies and platforms pop up that are tapping into the crowd. Waze, that you heard about yesterday, is a classic example of this. This is a great example. Nokia, the iPhone gets announced in January 2007. Nokia gets freaked out by this, buys Navtech, right, which owned all the road sensors. $8 billion, $8.1 billion they spent on Navtech. 5 years later, at the same time, Waze launches and piggybacks on the GPS on people's cell phones. 5 years later, Nokia's market cap, what Nokia got sold for $7 billion, less than what they bought Waze for. And they have maybe 500,000 sensors in the roads across all of these Navtech sensors around the world. Waze has, 50 million users, and they have 50 million data points active as each of these users are moving around, right? There's no way you can compete with that. And nobody sees it coming. It kind of sneaks along the way, then it hits the knee of the curve, and boom, off the things go crazy. So we're seeing this absolutely new breed of organization pop up that is leveraging some of these disruptive technologies, leveraging assets outside itself, piggybacking on what's going on externally, using technology to tap into that flow and harness that capability, and then just exploding onto the scene. And here's some of the attributes that we've seen. The collaborative technologies is an obvious one to be able to communicate with your ecosystem. Small multi-skill teams, very critical for achieving that diversity of thought, beginner's mind, and so on. When students come to our organization, we have a 10-week summer program. For half the summer, we deliver about 300 hours of lectures, labs, and workshops from 160 different speakers on what is the future of all of these technologies. What's in the labs today? What's being commercialized tomorrow? Who are the thought leaders? What are the implications of all of these breakthroughs that we're seeing? When we get to the $100 genome, what will that enable? right? What applications will that allow? The second half of our summer, we challenge our students and say, come up with an idea that would impact 1 billion people within 10 years and launch it, right? And I'll give you one example. I was talking to, I can't see him right now, but the CIO for Red Bull, right? Right? So one of our alumni is created a company called Focus at Will. You put on a set of headsets, you play music, and it puts your brain into a focused alpha state instantly. Okay? And you can play the music for as long as you need to focus. Now, if you are a coffee grower or if you're Red Bull, you need to be aware of that because that may disrupt your business over time. If you're a student, if you're a knowledge worker, if you're a software developer, just being able to focus on demand just by playing music on a freemium model is pretty disruptive of how people are going to manage themselves. And I think if you look carefully, every one of your organizations is under threat in this new model. There are disruptive technologies all around you. What we did with the CPG world is we worked with Deloitte and we said, let's look at what are the disruptive startups in the consumer packaged goods space. And we noticed that if you went back through from 1990s to say 2005 or so, there may be 5 major disruptive breakthroughs in the CPG space. Loyalty cards, point-of-sale transactions, AI, cloud, RFID tags for supply chain management, and so on. When we looked at the space over the last 8 months or so, we found 200 startups trying to disrupt the CPG space. And when we separated the wheat from the chaff, there were maybe 80 that we identified that were really as big as each of those first 5 that I mentioned. So in an industry as traditional as CPG, there are fully 80 companies that are doing something very dramatic to change the space. And when we looked at how big companies were dealing with them, what we found was there was a few big companies, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, who had their eyes and ears and had partnered with most of those companies. The rest of the CPG companies didn't know they existed, right? And so in each of your industries, there are 12, 2 dozen, 3 dozen, 4 dozen very disruptive startups operating. And so a key element is find out who they are, partner with them, buy them if it makes sense, et cetera, so that you have a sense of what's going on. So we have a sense of, now you would think that you can only do this with small companies, right? They're the only ones that can leverage some of these capabilities, some of these techniques. We're finding that big companies are actually able to do this. How many of you are familiar with Valve software? Valve is a games company out of Seattle, and they operate on the no management structure model. They have no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no responsibilities. Essentially, if somebody likes a project, they go and work on that project, right? It has a higher revenue per employee than Microsoft. 300 people or so make about almost $3 billion in revenue. It's an unbelievably successful model. And you would think that that works, okay, it works in the cute, creative gaming space. It couldn't work at an operational company. In the research, I was talking to ING Direct out of Canada. And it turns out ING Direct in Canada has implemented this model. With fiduciary obligations, legal restrictions, all of the hassle that come from being in a regulated environment, they have employees operating with no reporting lines, no job descriptions, no management meetings, no management layers of any kind. And in the comparable banks in Canada, they have about 10,000 in deposits per employee. ING is able to have 40,000 in deposits per employee. Adobe has done something interesting. They have what's called a Red Box program. They've given every employee a box, a startup instruction kit inside and a $1,000 check, and said, go spend this on something interesting that you think is cool. And then they have a funnel system to see which of the coolest ideas that they can then invest more in and bring that in. So we're seeing these really interesting models where large companies are taking some of these ideas and actually very successfully implementing them internally. GE looked at Quirky, tried to compete with them. At the end, just said, okay, let's just partner with them. There's no way they can compete with 29 days from idea to invention, and they essentially licensed their entire patent portfolio to Quirky inventors. Quirky has a social network of about 500,000 inventors around the world, and they every week pick one product and they kind of take it to market. And because they then crowdsource and do market validation in parallel with the design, in parallel with the manufacturing plans that they have with their Chinese manufacturers, and that's how they are able to achieve that incredible speed. And GE said, look, let's partner with you. Here's our patent portfolio. go to town and let's learn from this, right? And so essentially, one of the key metrics and elements that you'll have to think about is how do you juxtapose with this disruptive world around you? All of your structures, I think you folks have the hardest role in the world today, because you're trying to deal with very disruptive change on the outside and trying to deliver reliability and precision and security on the inside, right? Very difficult tension to manage. So we have advice for large organizations. Every 6 months we do a 4-day event with CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. And we've kind of evolved a few key mechanisms. The first is transform your leadership. Make people aware of the fact that this disruption is happening. It is incredible to see when you heard about some of it yesterday, but we're seeing that happen in pretty much every industry, every technology: drones, synthetic biology, robotics, big data, sensors, medicine, neuroscience, etc. Vinod Khosla has publicly spoken and said, in an industry as traditional as healthcare, 80% of what doctors do today will be replaced by technology within a decade. 80%. That's a pretty profound statement, right? And we're seeing, so the first thing to do is update your leadership and make sure they're aware that these technologies are coming and how disruptive they will be. The second is, you cannot buy one of these organizations easily, or if you buy it, you have to leave it alone. The most successful acquisition that Yahoo did was Flickr, and what they did is essentially let Flickr operate on the outside and not try and bring it into the company, and that's what made it successful. Find the startups around you that are disruptive in your space. Hire a team that will go and disrupt you. Because if you're not disrupting yourself, somebody else is, right? And then finally, leverage all of the data and the information that you have around you, expose that to your ecosystem and see what happens there. Because one thing's for sure, we've gone from 1.2 billion people online in 2010, we'll have 5 billion people online in 2020, and they're all gonna be like this, right? How many are familiar with Jack Andreka? Right? So Jack is 14 years old, a family friend dies of pancreatic cancer. He gets very upset about this, does some searches on Google, finds in some clinical trials a biomarker that might be interesting to detect early stage cancer, does a bunch more Google searches, right? And essentially finds that carbon nanotubes are really good at detecting this biomarker, puts the two together, writes a paper, sends it to the top 200 cancer researchers in the world saying, hey, can I come in and play with this idea? Most of them look at this and go, the kid's 14. The kid's 14, he doesn't have a medical degree, he can't possibly have figured it out. Johns Hopkins happened to be in the neighborhood. They brought him in to listen to this weirdness. It turns out he's correct. He has actually found, they gave him 6 months of lab time, he has found an early stage cancer detection test that costs 3 cents. The kid's 14, right? If you're a cancer researcher today, you're deeply embarrassed by this, right? His Wikipedia entry, by the way, says scientist, inventor, cancer researcher, born 1997. Right? It's just like, so this is essentially what we're all dealing with. That this disruption is going to happen with all of the kids powered by all of these laptops and all of these Chromebooks and all of these tablets that we're giving out, and how will we navigate that? So, thank you for your time. It's great to have you here, and thank you for listening to me.